The sun hung low over the Pacific Islands as March 9, 1945, drew toward evening. Across the American airfields of Guam, Saipan, and Tinian, captured Japanese territory now transformed into forward bases. Ground crews worked with focused intensity. Stretched along the runways were 325 Boeing B-29 Super Fortress bombers, their silver fuselages gleaming in the fading light. Teams of mechanics and technicians performed their final inspections, checking systems, verifying fuel loads, and confirming that every aircraft was ready for what would become history's most devastating single air raid. Major General Curtis LeMay had arrived at the 21st Bomber Command with a vision that would fundamentally reshape the air war against Japan. The bombing tactics used until now had achieved disappointing results, and LeMay believed it was time for something completely different. His orders were radical, revolutionary even. Instead of the traditional high-altitude precision bombing that had failed repeatedly, he would strip away the defensive armaments from most positions on each aircraft. Gone would be the weight of defensive gunners and ammunition. In their place would come nearly double the normal payload, not conventional bombs, but cluster munitions packed with 1,520 individual incendiary bomblets per plane. Each bomblet carried napalm designed to burn with ferocious intensity at 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit. The target was a decision that revealed the true scope of the operation. The Shitamachi district of Tokyo housed 750,000 people living in wooden structures crammed into just 12 square miles. These were working-class neighborhoods, densely packed with families, small businesses, and cottage industries. What made the district particularly significant to American planners was what lay hidden within those residential areas. Small workshops and factories producing aircraft components, electrical equipment, and precision instruments essential to Japan's war effort. The strategic logic was clear, yet controversial. At 5:35 in the afternoon, the first B-29 began its takeoff run from Guam's North Field. The roar of the massive Wright R-3350 engines split the tropical air as the enormous bomber gathered speed, its wheels leaving the runway. One after another, at 50-second intervals, the silver giants lifted skyward. The bombers would fly individually rather than in formation, each navigating by LORAN radio signals. They had been stripped down for this mission, most of their defensive guns removed to reduce weight, their bomb bays loaded far beyond normal capacity. This would be a night operation, low-level runs that would keep them beneath the clouds where Japanese radarless fighters struggled to operate in darkness. The B-29 itself represented the pinnacle of American aircraft manufacturing. The effort to create it had consumed over 1.4 million engineering hours and cost $3 billion, more than even the Manhattan Project. 4 pressurized crew compartments protected the men inside, and revolutionary remote-controlled gun turrets allowed gunners to defend the aircraft without exposing themselves to the elements. Each B-29 stretched 99 feet from nose to tail, with wings spanning 141 feet. The 4 engines could produce 2,200 horsepower each, carrying up to 20,000 pounds of ordnance across ranges of 1,600 miles, reaching altitudes approaching 32,000 feet. By March 1945, American factories had produced roughly 2,000 of these strategic bombers, with production lines still accelerating. The Wichita plant alone was building 4.2 Super Fortresses per day. The 20th Air Force, commanded personally by General Hap Arnold, had deployed these machines first from bases in China beginning in June 1944. Then came the shift to the Mariana Islands starting in mid-November. From Guam, Saipan, and Tinian, the 3 bombardment wings of the 21st Bomber Command could now launch over 300 bombers on a single mission. Each aircraft represented the dedication of specialized ground crews working through day and night. Japan's air defense system in early 1945 told a starkly different story. The Imperial Japanese Army and Navy operated completely separate command structures with virtually no coordination between them. Their principal night fighter, the Nakajima J-1N Gecko, or Moonlight, had been hastily modified from a reconnaissance aircraft. It carried twin 20mm cannons angled upward at 30 degrees and another pair pointing downward, allowing attacks from unexpected angles. Yet Japan had produced only 479 of these throughout the entire war, and many had already been lost. The Kawasaki Ki-45 Toryu, or Dragon Killer, served as an alternative, equipped with a 37mm cannon and oblique-firing 20mm guns. Since 1941, Japanese factories had built just 1,701 of them. Without radar capabilities for night interception, Japanese pilots depended on searchlights and visual identification, tasks nearly impossible in darkness against fast bombers. Ground defenses were equally inadequate. Tokyo possessed fewer than 500 heavy anti-aircraft guns spread across the entire metropolitan area. The Type 98 88mm gun handled high-altitude defense, while the Type 98 20mm cannon provided close-range protection, though its effective ceiling only reached 11,500 feet. Most critically, Japan had no fire control radar for its anti-aircraft artillery. Gunners relied on optical rangefinders and sound locators, equipment that became useless in poor weather or at night. The contrast was striking. America could field hundreds of B-29s from the Mariana Islands alone, while Japan could muster perhaps 200 operational night fighters across the entire homeland by March 1945. Fuel shortages had crippled Japanese pilot training. New aviators had minimal experience flying at night, their hours in the air severely rationed as aviation gasoline became increasingly scarce. Many aircraft sat grounded, their fuel reserved for the anticipated American invasion. Major General Curtis LeMay had assumed command of the 21st Bomber Command in January 1945, inheriting a strategic bombing campaign that had disappointed through repeated failures. High-altitude precision bombing from 30,000 feet had proven wholly ineffective. The jet stream, winds exceeding 200 miles per hour, scattered bombs miles from their intended targets. Climbing to those altitudes with heavy bomb loads strained the engines mercilessly, with magnesium alloy components overheating dangerously. Cloud cover obscured targets 70% of the time, forcing bombardiers to rely on primitive radar that provided poor accuracy. LeMay analyzed these operational failures and reached a revolutionary conclusion. The solution lay not in doing the same things better, but in doing something entirely different. He ordered the removal of all defensive guns except those in the tail position. This allowed each B-29 to carry 7 tons of incendiaries instead of the standard 3.5 tons of high explosives. Flying at 5,000 to 9,000 feet would bypass the jet stream entirely, reduce engine strain, and dramatically improve bombing accuracy. Night operations would minimize exposure to Japanese fighters that lacked radar and experienced night-flying pilots. Individual navigation using LORAN radio signals meant bombers would attack in a continuous stream over several hours rather than concentrated formations vulnerable to enemy interception. Weather forecasts predicted ideal conditions for March 9 and 10. Clear skies and strong surface winds would guarantee that fires spread across the target zone. The Shitamachi district, particularly the wards of Asakusa, Honjo, and Fukagawa, had been selected with precision. American intelligence officers had consulted maps prepared by the Office of Strategic Services, documents ranking Tokyo's neighborhoods by infrastructure density using pre-war Japanese urban planning surveys. These working-class areas housed extended families in wooden structures separated only by narrow alleys. It was here that Japanese cottage industries produced critical war materials in small workshops integrated throughout the residential zones. The M69 incendiary bomblet represented advanced weaponry. Each hexagonal steel pipe measured 3 inches in diameter and 20 inches long, weighing 6 pounds. Unlike earlier thermite or magnesium designs that burned intensely but could be extinguished, the M69 used napalm, jellied gasoline developed through collaboration between Standard Oil and Harvard University scientists. Bombers carried clusters of 38 individual bomblets that separated at 2,000 feet altitude. Each deployed a cotton streamer to orient its fuse downward. Upon impact, a time delay fuse burned for 3 to 5 seconds before a white phosphorus charge detonated, dispersing burning napalm up to 100 feet in multiple directions. The delayed action ensured the weapon would be lying on its side when it exploded, maximizing the spread of incendiary material through buildings and structures. Testing at Dugway Proving Ground in Utah had demonstrated the M69's devastating effectiveness against replica Japanese homes. The weapon created multiple ignition points across wide areas, and the napalm adhered to surfaces, resisting water-based firefighting efforts. A single B-29 carried 40 cluster bombs containing 1,520 individual bomblets. Of the 325 bombers launched, 279 ultimately reached the target. Operation Meeting House would drop approximately 424,000 incendiary bomblets on Tokyo, an unprecedented concentration of incendiary weapons. American planners calculated this density would create a self-sustaining conflagration where separate fires would merge, generating powerful wind currents that would spread the inferno beyond the initial impact zones. Just after 5:30 in the afternoon on March 9th, the first B-29 lifted off from Guam. Piloting the mission commander's aircraft was Brigadier General Thomas Sarsfield Power of the 314th Bombardment Wing. Over the following hours, bombers launched at 50-second intervals from the three island bases. The 14-hour round trip would test both crews and aircraft to their absolute operational limits. Crews wore lighter flight gear instead of heavy suits, taking advantage of the warmer temperatures at the lower altitudes. Without the weight of guns, gunners, and ammunition, the bombers climbed efficiently, conserving fuel during the 1,500-mile journey to Japan. As they approached the Japanese coast, Mount Fuji's snow-capped peak emerged from the darkness, serving as a prominent navigation checkpoint. Air raid sirens began wailing through Tokyo around 10:30 in the evening, though most inhabitants initially remained in their homes. Previous high-altitude raids had caused limited damage, and this complacency would prove catastrophic. Tokyo's civil defense preparations were woefully inadequate for what approached. The city possessed only 18 concrete air raid shelters capable of protecting 90,000 people from a population exceeding 4.3 million residents. Most families relied on bokutai, shallow trenches covered with boards or simple dugouts, offering minimal protection against incendiaries. The city's 8,000 firefighters possessed primarily hand pumps and bucket brigades designed for peacetime emergencies. Neighborhood associations had organized civilian firefighting groups consisting mainly of elderly residents, women, and teenagers, equipped with sand buckets and water containers. The first Pathfinder B-29s arrived over Tokyo at 12:08 in the morning on March 10th. They approached from different directions to mark the target zone, flying at just 5,000 feet. They dropped M47 napalm bombs that immediately created visible fire markers, forming an enormous burning X that illuminated the sky. The main force arrived minutes later, with bombardiers aiming for the glowing markers. The weather conditions proved advantageous for the operation. Clear visibility, combined with surface winds between 17 and 28 miles per hour, though gusts reached up to 45 miles per hour. As the M69 clusters separated and descended, observers described them as metallic objects glinting in the firelight, a sight that preceded unprecedented urban devastation. Within minutes of the first impacts, thousands of individual fires erupted across the target zone. The strong winds quickly spread flames from building to building, merging separate blazes into a massive conflagration. Temperatures at ground level exceeded 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit, sufficient to melt glass and metal infrastructure. The superheated air created powerful updrafts, generating intense wind vortices that lifted debris high into the atmosphere. Streets became impassable as asphalt itself ignited. Wooden buildings collapsed from the extreme heat. The sound of the inferno overwhelmed all other noise, while smoke and heat reduced visibility to mere feet. 24-year-old Yoshiko Hashimoto was at home in Tokyo's Sumida district with her 13-month-old baby when the attack began. Her husband, an army officer, was on guard duty across the city. She would later provide testimony describing the horror she experienced. The B-29s were dropping countless firebombs, and it sounded like heavy rain. I was astounded by the intensity of the air raid. I had never seen anything like it before, she would recall. As fires spread with terrifying speed, Yoshiko fled with her parents, baby, and sisters through streets choked with evacuating residents. The narrow alleys of Shitamachi became deadly traps as thousands attempted to escape simultaneously. Parents became separated from children in the chaos. Elderly residents who fell were unable to continue, trampled by the desperate surge of humanity. Firefighting brigades abandoned their equipment when temperatures made it impossible to approach the flames. At the Sumida River, Yoshiko witnessed scenes of overwhelming chaos. Burning debris was falling around us, and the wind kept intensifying, she remembered. Burning materials, signboards, wooden doors, and household items filled the air. Warehouses on both riverbanks were engulfed entirely in flames. Her father pushed her and the baby into the water, an action that would save their lives. Her mother perished along with Yoshiko's father and her sister Etsuko. Across the burning district, similar tragedies repeated endlessly. Those who entered canals faced extreme water temperatures. Others were overwhelmed in the desperate rush as thousands tried to reach water simultaneously. The conflagration's winds were powerful enough to move people significant distances. Some were discovered far from their original locations. Police stations, hospitals, and designated evacuation centers became surrounded by advancing flames. At Kikukawa Elementary School, a designated shelter, investigators later found only metal objects and remains among the ashes where hundreds had sought safety. Buddhist temples that had stood for centuries were destroyed, along with those who had sought shelter within their walls. The extreme conditions created by the inferno meant that even those in shelters faced severe challenges from heat and smoke. The superheated air caused severe respiratory damage to anyone exposed, even briefly. Following the raid, casualty estimates varied significantly among different authorities. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey calculated 87,793 fatalities and 4,918 injuries. The Tokyo Metropolitan Police Department reported 83,793 deaths and 40,018 wounded. The Tokyo Fire Department estimated 97,000 killed and 125,000 wounded. Historical consensus indicates that over 100,000 people perished, exceeding the immediate casualties from either atomic bombing. The attack destroyed 267,171 buildings across 15.8 square miles, eliminating fully 25% of Tokyo's structures. Over 1 million survivors lost their homes entirely. The industrial impact was severe and immediate. More than half of Tokyo's manufacturing occurred in small workshops within residential areas, and their destruction significantly disrupted production of essential war materials. Thousands of skilled workers were lost or displaced from the city permanently. American losses proved comparatively minimal. 14 B-29s failed to return, with 96 airmen listed as killed or missing. Several bombers encountered severe turbulence from the thermal updrafts created by the fires, causing temporary loss of control. Others received anti-aircraft damage during their low-level bombing runs, though Japanese gunners struggled to track aircraft at such unusual altitudes. Aircrew members later reported detecting smoke even at their operational altitude, a testament to the unprecedented scale of the conflagration below. The crews who had begun with doubts about Lamei's approach found themselves confronted with the sheer scope of what had just occurred. The general himself would later grapple with what his decisions had unleashed. Looking back, he acknowledged a hard truth. Had his side lost, he would almost certainly have faced prosecution as a war criminal. General Arnold's response came swiftly. Congratulatory words arrived emphasizing the courage displayed by his airmen. The operation's consequences rippled through American military strategy immediately and profoundly. Within just 10 days, Nagoya, Osaka, and Kobe all faced similar assaults. Japan's four most significant urban centers were now burning. The campaign ground to a halt, not from choice, but because the 21st Bomber Command had depleted its supply of incendiary ordnance. American factories responded by accelerating M69 production, recognizing the strategic advantage these weapons provided. The gap between American and Japanese capabilities had never been wider. When America lost a B-29, replacement aircraft rolled off production lines within weeks. Japan, by contrast, faced neighborhoods reduced to rubble that could not be rebuilt, and workers who could not be replaced. The manufacturing disparity was staggering. American output ran roughly 10 times that of Japan, and every American weapon functioned with technical superiority that multiplied its destructive potential. The B-29 program alone had consumed $3 billion, exceeding Japan's entire 1945 military budget. By mid-1945, American factories were churning out 50,000 tons of incendiary bombs every month, while Japan struggled merely to sustain ammunition production. The American campaign reflected methodical calculation, a scientific approach to destroying an enemy nation. Behind this destruction lay careful research. The Chemical Warfare Service had constructed exact replicas of Japanese neighborhoods at Dugway Proving Ground, working from architectural designs predating the war. Standard Oil's development team had engineered napalm through rigorous chemical investigation. Harvard and the University of Chicago had contributed their own analytical expertise, mapping the patterns by which fire would spread through urban areas. This fusion of academic research with military application stood in sharp contrast to Japanese military thinking, which venerated tradition and cultural values above material reality. That doctrine proved catastrophically inadequate when facing modern industrial warfare. Japan possessed no effective countermeasures, no strategic answer. The February 25th preliminary attack had obliterated 28,000 structures, yet authorities implemented virtually no improvements to fire prevention systems. Fire breaks that might have slowed the flames were never cut through the city. Evacuation protocols remained mostly unexecuted blueprints. Military leadership ordered civilians to remain in place, even as intelligence reports warned of devastating incendiary campaigns being planned and prepared. Coordination failures and rigid military command structures bore responsibility for this paralysis. Japanese night fighter pilots struggled with fundamental disadvantages. Men like Lieutenant Satsuo Endo occasionally achieved success, credited with intercepting 8 B-29s, but such accomplishments were exceptional anomalies, rather than representative of broader capability. Most night fighter pilots faced an impossible task. Darkness itself became their enemy. The smoke rising from fires below rendered navigation virtually impossible. Without airborne radar systems, they relied on ground controllers using acoustic detection equipment, methods that collapsed entirely once the conflagration began. Pilots who did manage to reach their targets discovered that 20-millimeter cannon fire often proved inadequate against the B-29's sturdy frame. Direct hits on engines or fuel tanks were required. Some pilots, in desperation, opted for ramming attacks that would kill them along with their targets. Tokyo's fire department illustrated the broader infrastructure crisis. The city maintained 286 fire engines, most of them manual pump equipment requiring numerous operators to function. Water pressure proved insufficient for combating large fires. The water system itself had been compromised by earlier damage. Fire department doctrine emphasized protecting individual buildings through conventional methods, entirely inadequate for thousands of simultaneous fires breaking out across the urban landscape. When the firestorm erupted, fire companies collapsed under the immediate onslaught. Their equipment burned, personnel were forced to retreat. The psychological weight on those who survived was devastating and permanent. Many felt that everything they had relied upon for protection had simply evaporated. Those fleeing Tokyo carried their testimonies throughout the nation. Official government accounts of the war effort lost credibility. Factory workers stopped showing up for their shifts, confidence in victory shattered. The phrase routine air raid entered everyday conversation as city after city appeared on target lists. By August 1945, 66 Japanese cities had endured major incendiary attacks. Much of Japan's urban infrastructure lay in ruins before nuclear weapons ever entered the war. This campaign directly shaped American planning for Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of Japan's home islands. Planners believed that sustained incendiary bombing would eliminate remaining war production by October. LeMay himself believed strategic bombing might compel surrender without requiring an invasion. The Joint Chiefs of Staff estimated that conventional bombing had already killed approximately 900,000 civilians, with millions more likely to perish if fighting continued to its logical conclusion. These calculations influenced President Truman's thinking on atomic weapons. He came to view them not as radical alternatives to conventional bombing, but as potentially decisive psychological shock. Yet the human element transcended national boundaries and military calculations. American air crews carried psychological weight for decades afterward, wrestling with their participation in events regardless of wartime necessity. Richard Bale, flying with the 9th Bombardment Group, watched the fires consuming the city below his aircraft, an image that never truly left him. Japanese survivors bore physical scars and emotional ones that shaped the remainder of their lives. Families from both nations experienced losses that could never be recovered. Children lost parents, wives became widows. The social welfare systems were overwhelmed. Post-war reconstruction had to address not only physical devastation, but orphaned children and displaced populations. The destruction proved comprehensive beyond initial assessment. Medical centers vanished, schools burned, religious institutions were consumed, government buildings disappeared. Where eastern Tokyo had stood on the morning of March 10th, only concrete foundations and brick rubble remained, stretching for miles across an ash-covered wasteland. Survivors returned searching for familiar landmarks that no longer existed in any recognizable form. Heavy equipment became necessary just to clear pathways through the debris. Countless victims could never be identified. Funeral ceremonies proceeded for weeks in an endless procession. Waterways remained choked with wreckage. The industrial consequences exceeded expectations. Tokyo's eastern districts housed thousands of small family workshops producing specialized components. Precision instruments, electrical equipment, mechanical parts. With these workshops gone, supply chains fractured. Major factories suddenly lacked the components they required. The loss of skilled craftspeople, machinists, technical specialists, workers who embodied years of accumulated knowledge, proved irreplaceable. Surviving workers suffered declining productivity as they grappled with personal tragedies, housing destroyed, and collapsed morale. After restocking incendiary supplies, operations resumed in May with improved tactics delivering enhanced results. By July, B-29s were dropping warning leaflets ahead of raids, informing populations which cities would burn next. Psychological operations declaring total air supremacy. These missions faced minimal resistance, becoming almost routine. Japanese air defense deteriorated steadily as experienced pilots fell, ammunition dwindled, and civilian defense infrastructure crumbled. The legal and moral dimensions remained contested. The 1907 Hague Convention had addressed bombardment of defenseless cities, yet defining what constituted a defended or military target proved enormously complicated. Post-war tribunals prosecuted certain leaders for targeting civilians, but did not examine Allied bombing campaigns. The principle emerged that military necessity could justify civilian casualties, a precedent affecting international law's subsequent development, even as precision weapons advanced technologically. Weather science played a crucial role in amplifying effects. The March 9th to 10th attack was deliberately timed to exploit predicted wind patterns following a dry spell. Meteorologists had studied Japanese weather extensively, identifying conditions optimal for fire propagation. The actual winds that night, ranging from 17 to 45 miles per hour depending on location, exceeded some projections. This marriage of meteorological data with military operations typified American strategic thinking. But individual B-29 crews experienced the mission differently than planners had anticipated. Many were profoundly affected by witnessing destruction unfold beneath them. Some reported observing smoke and atmospheric disturbance even at their operational altitude. Pilots fought severe turbulence generated by thermal forces. Certain crew members requested different assignments afterward, unable to reconcile their actions with personal conscience. Others rationalized their participation through the strategic objective, ending the conflict rapidly. Japanese military response exposed command failures. Anti-aircraft batteries maintained continuous fire but achieved little in darkness and smoke. Fighter squadrons launched 90 sorties, yet scored only scattered successes. Fire department commanders received inadequate warning about the raid's scope. Military priorities focused on protecting government and military sites, while civilian neighborhoods burned unchecked. Communication systems failed as infrastructure burned. Messengers could not traverse devastated areas. Historical memory evolved differently. Hiroshima and Nagasaki gained worldwide attention. Tokyo's firebombing remained less known internationally. Survivors fought for decades to have their accounts recorded. Katsumoto Tsutomi, himself a survivor, founded the Center of the Tokyo Raids and War Damage to preserve testimonies that might have disappeared. Contemporary military strategists examine Operation Meeting House, seeking lessons about air power's possibilities and constraints. The raid demonstrated that destroying cities doesn't necessarily force immediate surrender. Japan continued fighting for 5 more months. It proved technical advantages can overcome geographic obstacles, yet showed how difficult distinguishing military from civilian targets becomes in modern warfare. Area bombing emerged through tactical escalation rather than formal policy revision. Initially, the 21st Bomber Command attempted precision strikes following established doctrine. When these disappointed results, LAME shifted toward area incendiary attacks that proved operationally simpler and more devastating. This transition happened through command decisions rather than explicit orders. By March 1945, targeting choices reflected population density and industrial distribution rather than specific military installations. Survivor accounts reveal persistent trauma. Many experienced lasting psychological consequences throughout their remaining years. Children separated from parents never discovered what happened to family members. Historical archives preserve testimony like Yoshiko Hashimoto's words. The memory of that night never leaves me. My mother, father, and sister died while my baby and I survived. I think about them every day. Tokyo's working-class social fabric was shredded, extended families scattered, established family businesses ceased existing, neighborhood communities stretching back generations vanished overnight. Assessing Operation Meeting House requires examining whether it genuinely ended the war. Historians debate whether bombing alone might have compelled surrender, yet the raids clearly hastened Japan's military deterioration. Systematic destruction created circumstances where continued resistance grew progressively harder. Emperor Hirohito later cited bombing campaigns and domestic conditions as factors in the surrender decision. The 100,000 who perished in Tokyo contributed to ending a conflict that invasion likely would have extended, potentially multiplying casualties enormously. A calculation offering survivors minimal consolation but shaping military decisions. Operation Meeting House demonstrates warfare's transformation from limited military contests to comprehensive national struggles. Communities built across generations burned in hours through weapons manufactured continents away. A conflict beginning with territorial conquest concluded with industrial technology affecting populations with minimal military connection. The contrast between B-29s delivering sophisticated incendiaries and Japanese defenders armed with primitive firefighting equipment underscored industrial and technical dominance. Historically ironic, this operation's impact faded when atomic weapons arrived 5 months later. Greater immediate death toll became secondary compared to nuclear weapons' unique nature, allowing conventional bombing reduced scrutiny. This perspective permitted developing conventional area weapons and various incendiary applications in subsequent conflicts without nuclear-style prohibition. Statistics only partially illuminate meaning. 325 B-29s launched. 279 reached their objective. 1,665 tons of incendiaries fell. 15.8 square miles burned. 267,171 buildings disappeared. 100,000 perished. 1 million displaced. Behind each number existed individuals, air crews executing orders, families sleeping in residential areas, children separated from parents, survivors bearing profound losses. Operation Meeting House stands as history's most destructive air raid, not a military triumph, but a sobering testament to modern warfare's destructive potential. Where strategic goals can overshadow civilian consequences and entire populations become targets in industrial-scale conflict.